Hi everybody, my name's Emma Langley and I work at the University of Warwick in the Department for Education Studies, and I'm really delighted to be here to be invited to talk more about the work that I've been doing over the past 3 to 4 years, which has been increasingly focused on fatherhood and fathers of disabled children. And I'm also delighted to be joined by dads that have been involved from the start of this, really. So Chris Jones, can just give a little wave, Neil Boone and Paul Dimbleby, who will introduce themselves a little bit more a little bit later on, and talk through the resource that we created back during the first lockdown. So good times. So as Jane mentioned, I work in family research and I've been doing that for about 8 years now, increasingly becoming more focused on father wellbeing. So it became quite apparent during my PhD work that the voices of dads were missing. So I've been trying to address that since then. So my research is applied. And what that essentially means is I'm trying to have some kind of impact on disabled people and their families, and for it to be a positive impact, and to raise awareness and inform tailored, timely, and also evidence-based support based on what parents tell me, and then moving forward to support them in their day-to-day lives. Increasingly, I'm also ensuring that the research is informed by parents at the very beginning. So I have their input during the design of a research project and when conducting a research project at various points, depending on what time commitments and capacity parents have. So as I mentioned, become increasingly focused on fathers over time. And it's hope through this work that we can kind of generate some more momentum and continue to do more research that leads to evidence-based support. So I'm going to just talk first of all about the importance of supporting fathers of disabled children. Why is it that we are doing this work, and why is it important to do webinars such as this? I'm then going to share some current research. So I've been doing a small scale project, and I'm going to share some of the exploratory findings that's looking at some of the challenges that dads say that they're facing in their parenting role. I'm then going to hand over to Chris, who's going to talk through our wellbeing resource and how that kind of came about, how it was conceptualized, how we went about it, and what the main themes are. And then Paul and Neil are going to actually talk through some of those themes and add their own experiences in through that. And then finally, towards the end, just going to leave it open. I appreciate we've got a kind of mixed audience of professionals and parents and dads, so it's hard to accommodate everybody in what they're aiming to get from this webinar, but I just thought it would be good to just kind of chat through some of the things that we've learned in terms of engaging and supporting fathers in research or in sort of engagement work, and then there'll be time for some questions. So why fathers? Why do we focus on this in our work, in our research? And I'm probably already preaching to the converted here, but it's because dads matter. They matter as an individual, they matter as a father, they matter as a part of a family unit. So fathers play a really important role in the development of their children, and so by recognising and supporting their needs, hopefully it has a positive impact on their well-being, but also the well-being of the rest of their family. We're also aware of sort of bigger societal expectations and political drivers. So those things that say to us, how we should be and how we should parent. So fathers are expected to be not just the breadwinner anymore, but to be emotionally involved in parenting and have a nurturing relationship with their children. And later on, when I talk about some of the challenges, sometimes it's trying to hold that dual role of being a breadwinner, but also having caregiving responsibilities. And fathers, like mothers of disabled children, are likely to face a range of additional challenges that we need to capture and we need to support. So in research, we've been very good at talking to mothers and knowing what kinds of challenges they face and what kind of support they might need. And obviously we still need to do that. It's not downplaying the experiences that mums are having, and they are usually the primary caregiver, but it's not necessarily how dads feel about a particular experience. So it's really important that we do what we've been doing for mums, but also for dads as well, in order to make sure that the support that's available is tailored to them. And this is where we kind of kind of emphasize the importance of research, really, because if we know more about fathers' experiences, this can then help shape the kind of support that they say they need going forward. And then lastly, links to these wider agendas, so male mental health and also the mental health of men who become fathers. Increasingly, there's awareness around postnatal depression in fathers. So there is a much broader agenda at the moment that's becoming more kind of aware that there are some challenges that men face, both as men but also as fathers. So it kind of taps into sort of that wider importance of why we should be focusing on dads. So I'm now going to talk through a recent project. So this started in September last year. It's just a small scale project. It's a pilot study, which essentially means we do a little study just to see if it's any good, if there's ways we can kind of improve on it, and if there's a justification to apply for greater funding and do a much larger project. So this particular project came from conversations with fathers that are here today about what is it we think that we need to be talking about and researching. And one of the things that came up was focusing on the role that dads play. Can we capture it? Can we sort of write it down and tell people about it? And also wanting to capture dads' experiences at different life stages as well. So in the research field, there tends to be a lot of focus on dads of children or dads that are very early on in the process. But what we discussed was actually it would be good to kind of understand how it evolves over time. How are dads of children who are in adolescent phase or are adults now experiencing day-to-day life, and what kind of challenges do they have? So this was a small scale study to try and capture that. So we were interested in fathers' experiences at different points in their children's lives, so when they're in childhood and adolescence and adulthood, and to try and capture some of the factors that influence their daily experiences. And this had the overall aim to understand what support fathers might need at different points in their parenting journey. So as I mentioned, it was only small scale, so we had 13 fathers from across the UK who took part in telephone and Zoom interviews. But just to give you a sense of the kind of demand for this, we had about 50 or 60 dads that wanted to take part, but because of funding implications, it was only a small funding project. We just couldn't do that. We just didn't have capacity, but it shows you the kind of appetite that there is for dads to actually come and tell their story. And just to give you a bit of a sense of the kind of demographics of the people that took part. So their children range between 5 and 24 years old. And again, we're talking about fathers of adults here, but they're still quite young adults. They're 24 years of age maximum. So that kind of tells us that we're still not sort of accessing dads who have got older adults. And how do we go about that? Where are they? How do we get them involved in research? And we were very inclusive in terms of our criteria for getting dads involved. So we didn't sort of exclude and put many criteria on that. But we did find that the primary area of need of their children was autism and a learning disability. But we also had fathers of children that had cerebral palsy, Down syndrome and complex health needs. Because again, I talked to the dads about the importance of getting a variety of different experiences and how that might have an impact on the type of role that dads have. We had 12 out of the 13 fathers were biological fathers, and we had one stepfather, and we had 2 fathers where they'd separated from the child's mother. And again, we felt it was really important to include different family compositions. And the last case was a father where they had an adult, but they'd recently moved into residential care. So all of these factors do have an impact on the kind of role going forward. And the last thing just to say on this slide, going back to my original point about having collaboration with parents all the way through research, is that we had 3 fathers involved as advisors to this project. So thinking about the conceptualization of what we're trying to do, what do the adverts look like? Would they be attractive to dads? What does the interview schedule look like? What kind of questions are we asking? So it was really great to have their input during this stage to make sure it was appropriate for dads. And going by the amount of interest that we had, it obviously worked. So the main thing that I just want to talk about now is fathers' roles, because that was the focus of this particular study, and it has an impact on well-being. So we asked fathers about their roles and responsibilities and the kinds of factors that have an impact. And here we weren't just thinking about the amount of time, so the quantity or the availability that fathers were there for their children. We were very much interested in the quality, what they were actually doing, trying to describe what their role looked like. And of course, there was natural variation in roles and responsibilities, as you would expect for mothers as well. But there were also some key similarities in terms of what dads were describing they were doing for their children and how that changed over time. And then the important thing I want to emphasize here, that no matter what their role was at that particular time, dads were really keen to stress that they would like an even more greater role. They would like to do more, but some more than others were hindered by particular factors, which I'll talk about in a few moments' time. So this is sort of the way I'm going about describing. I'm just starting to really map out, because I work quite visually anyway, some of the things that dads were telling me that they were doing. And what you can see in front of you is that they're actually doing quite a lot. We haven't really captured that within research before. And their role involves, as you can see on the left-hand side, support for their child, but also, if relevant in the context, support for their partner or their wife, and support for the rest of the family as well. So being a provider and supporting other children. And just also a relevant point with supporting their partner, even dads that were no longer living with the partner, there was still that element of support. There was still very much an understanding that they needed to, in some way, support their partner in terms of their day-to-day caregiving responsibilities. So just to sort of talk through a few things on here. So you can see here there's the direct care responsibilities, and again that varied, but there was a lot of talk of personal caregiving, what they actually do on a day-to-day basis, spending time doing activities, routines and rituals, so making sure that things were done that were important for their child's day-to-day well-being, and this was particularly relevant for autistic children. Supporting children with their health needs, perhaps doing occupational therapy, exercises with them, and also supporting them in terms of education. And some fathers talked about the need to do homeschooling as well. Really relevant to parents of disabled children is the indirect care. And this is kind of the additional, isn't it? It's the admin that's involved, all of these different things that are above and beyond usually, in terms of caring for a disabled person. So dads were doing various amounts of this. So some were arranging care services, some were kind of taking on those battles, navigating the system, advocating for their child. Some were doing less than that. Some over time had become more used to doing that because they'd kind of negotiated with their wife or their partner, and they were struggling with it, they were getting overwhelmed with it, so the dad kind of took it on. So you can see there's lots of different instances, and why time, focusing on how things change over time, is really, really important, because it does, as life happens and events happen, there's shifts in terms of how mum and dad do this, how they parent. And the last thing that I just want to say for this slide is dad's also talked about the longevity of the role, and how that, in the first instance, when they might get a diagnosis or they understand that their child might have particular needs that are a little bit different, is they understand and feel overwhelmed that their role might not get easier over time. In fact, it might get more difficult. And for those that were later on down the line, they definitely confirmed that, this idea that you would expect as you get older as a parent that your responsibilities are not diminished, but in terms of kind of personal care and day-to-day care, direct care, those kinds of things would tail off, but actually it might stay the same, and it might get even more, particularly in the case of sort of personal care, as that child gets bigger and stronger, for example. So it was really key to to learn about that from dads of adults or older children. So I'm just going to talk through now. There are so many different factors that can have an impact on a father's role, and it is really hard to try and present to you sort of this is how it is because it is so varied. Even through talking to 13 fathers, they're 13 individuals at the end of the day with different children with different needs. But these were some of the common things that were coming through. So as you might expect, so work responsibilities definitely had an impact, positive or negative, on the type of role they were having in terms of their child's life. Lots of dads talked about a dual pressure, so kind of that catch-22, so having to provide for their family whilst also feeling guilty for going out to work, so having to negotiate that. They also felt that they wasn't really winning in either role, perhaps feeling less committed as a dad if they're going out to work, or feeling less committed as a worker, or perceived to be less committed as a worker if they've got to sort of rush off for appointments. Or one dad talked about being a self-employed carpenter and having to quickly change customers, and some customers not being happy about that, and the impact that on his identity and his reputation that had. So they often felt really compromised. And one thing that kind of came out from this was that those that had less flexibility in their work then couldn't really help as much as you would expect. So it tended to then fall back to those traditional roles of mum taking that on, doing more of the caregiving role. The second point is about communication with their partner, which again could be a barrier and could be a facilitator. It can be positive, it can be negative. So some dads kind of fell into the role and then didn't necessarily know how to get out of it. Some had communicated with their wife. There'd been some kind of communication about how things could go moving forwards, what kind of roles might they take that are aligned with their strengths. So some dads talked about how their partner found it difficult to kind of keep having those battles with particular professionals, or going through particular processes. So some dads kind of took that on to do that. In some instances that wasn't the case. So communication was kind of really important in terms of negotiating what kind of role the dad was going to have. And again, that did change over time. Knowledge was really, really important. So as we might expect, the more knowledge that a dad had about their child's disability or the system in particular, this meant they had a greater role. They had more confidence in their role, more likely to challenge things, understand things, and be involved in various ways. Their child's needs and abilities and behaviours, we would expect that changes the role completely. If you've got an autistic child compared to health needs, or there might be a combination. So it really was kind of evolving as that child was evolving, their abilities and their needs were changing, that the dad's role needs to change as well. And again, this is not necessarily specific to being a dad, this is to being a parent. But I just want to promote that dads are experiencing many of the same challenges that moms are. Something that is specific to that dad is their own rearing history. So how they might have parented themselves, kind of generational changes, might have impacted on how they then become a father. They might, in some circumstances, kind of want to reject what they'd had before. In other circumstances, it was a good example. So I'll talk in a little while about sort of what being a good parent meant to them, being a good father. And this, I think, was very much influenced by their own parenting history, their own rearing history. And then lastly, as I've mentioned quite a lot already, the real importance of time and how this shifts in terms of what the child needs, but also then how parents need to adapt. So there had also been some quite big changes in circumstances linked to the pandemic as well. So in some circumstances, dads had a lot more flexibility than what they'd had in the past. Perhaps their job had changed, or they had actively changed jobs because they'd had a change in priorities. They wanted to do things differently. Some dads had lost their job and it had forced some changes. So again, it's really important to capture how these kind of bigger events in the wider sphere have had some real substantial changes on the roles of dads. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about mental health, and just before I proceed, I just want to say that some of the things that dads are saying were quite sensitive, and I am going to talk a little bit about suicidal thoughts. So there are going to be some help, signposts to help in the chat that Jane's going to put there. But just as a trigger warning, some of these things are quite they're quite sensitive. So all dads talked about difficulties in terms of mental health. They discussed real difficulties at the start, particularly around diagnosis, understanding that their child was slightly different, and in particular what they found difficult was that real pressure to make things okay. So people kind of looking to them to be the rock, to be the most supportive person, and sometimes to have answers, and that felt like an enormous pressure for them. I would say out of all the dads, they talked about sort of when their child was about 5 or 6 years old, that time being particularly tricky for them. Perhaps they kind of got through the initial diagnosis stage, but then after that, going forward, they weren't really sure how to proceed. Many of them threw themselves into work because they found it was something that they knew how to do. It was something practical, something that they could do to support the rest of their family at that time. But some kind of reflected back on that and said, I shouldn't have done that. That was burying my head in the sand. Others felt that it was a really important thing to do at the time. Many dads talked about losing friends, social circles becoming smaller, which we know is a common occurrence for families of children with disabilities, and over time becoming more and more isolated. And this was particularly the case for fathers of adults. Over time, kind of support dropping off for them and for their children. And they really discussed the need to sort of belong somewhere. Where do I belong? Where is the support for me? Just feeling quite isolated. And as I mentioned at the start of this slide, some really difficult experiences that they talked to me about in terms of an experience of some real turmoil or trauma, using the words such as breakdown, crisis, crash, and some even describing some past suicidal thoughts. So this is the aim of the work, really, is to capture this and say there is a real support need. And many of the dads that I spoke to had never spoken to anybody about that experience. So you can imagine, both for me and for them, it's a difficult thing, but it really does sort of highlight the lack of support and space there is for dads to talk about what they have been through. So I'm just going to take a drink and let you just read some of those quotations. Okay. They're really powerful, aren't they? And I think just letting the voices of the people that took part in the research kind of tells you all you need to know, really. There we go. Okay. So I'm just going to move on now to talking about a particular aspect that I kind of am naming at the moment, the good dad. So this kind of came up quite a lot in the interviews. And in some ways, they were also asked explicitly about sort of how they felt about being a father. So, as you would expect, all the dads that took part wanted to be a good dad, and they were asked what that actually meant. So, the first thing that usually came up was being present, was being there. Some described how perhaps their dad hadn't as much, been out of work, not been as attentive, and perhaps they wanted to do something different compared to how they were brought up. But being present, being invested, being attentive was one of the main things that came up. They talked about wanting a positive and loving relationship, having shared experiences, and they also talked about being a good dad as also supporting their partner or their wife, so sharing care and supporting them as well. The difficulty was that for some of them, they found this ideal or how they perceived being a good dad quite difficult to achieve. So they felt that the demands of parenting a child with a disability were higher, the pressures were higher. They couldn't always do some of those typical, and this is in their words, father-child activities that maybe they'd envisaged was going to happen. In some circumstances, particularly where their child was non-verbal, they were getting less feedback from their child. So often we know we're doing something well because we can see a smile on the child's face, or they might tell us, they might say they love us. That might be more difficult. And also feeling less knowledgeable compared to their wife, so the child's mother. And this then had an impact. So it had an impact on how they felt. So not feeling like they were a good dad, or not knowing whether they were a good dad. Some felt kind of an aspect of failure. Well, I want to be this, I want to be a good dad, but I'm just not meeting those expectations, and perhaps I need to adjust how I think I am as a dad, which is quite difficult to hear, really. There's a difference between their ideal and their reality. And also it did have an impact on some of their behaviour. So for some of the dads, it involved them what I would call leaning in, so trying to do more. They really wanted to reject any negative dad stereotypes, wanted to prove people wrong. I am going to be a good dad. I do this. I'm going to do this. Whereas in some instances, there was more of a withdrawal, so doing less. So really unclear how to be a good dad, how to proceed. So quite difficult, really, in terms of how dads felt, or how they should be, or what societal expectations are of what a good dad looks like and what the reality was. And I do genuinely believe that in all of the cases, they knew they were being a good dad. It's just that when you go out to the supermarket and sensory overload, etc., and the child might have a meltdown, they talk about how other people might perceive them not to be a good parent for those reasons. So it can start to have an impact on your own identity and fathering. So just some more quotes there. Okay. So Dad's also talked about interactions with professionals and services, because it's a lot of what happens when you have a child with a disability. There's a lot more interaction with particular types of people and particular types of services. So there were various levels of engagement. And it's also important for me to point out that I'm talking about some negatives here, but there also were positive cases and examples as well where these things didn't happen. But there also were some very difficult interactions that dads talked about. And it often led to dads becoming less engaged with professionals, it becoming more of a rare event over time. So some of the experiences that dads had experienced were almost an annoyance that sometimes their involvement in their child's care was not recognised or was dismissed. So if you think back to that mapping activity, that diagram, if dads are doing, all of it or some of it or pockets of it, that needs to be recognised. If there was an assumption that they were the secondary caregiver, where there was actually a shared kind of co-parenting situation at home, or some dads being perceived to be called an activist dad. So if they're kind of seen to be involved, they are unique in some way, and it's not the norm. So it's kind of this idea that this term of warrior mums that we hear, though it's kind of the activist dad, oh, you want to know, you want to be here, do you, that kind of thing. So they often felt that kind of got their back up a little bit. And also the last one, sometimes the questions that they might have about their child maybe being perceived to be intimidating, or emotion perceived to be as aggression. And maybe this is where we do see some gender differences here in terms of how dads might be perceived, just asking sort of questions, as opposed to how mums might be perceived. And this often led to either suppression of those kind of thoughts or those questions, or reining it in, not asking the questions anymore, not saying anything, or in some cases it led to the dads not actually attending the meetings anymore. And then you could see how that becomes a cycle, because then they don't get first-hand information, and then that has an impact on their role. So just some, key things that came out of that, really, in terms of that's their experience, that's how they have experienced that, and moving forward, being kind of mindful of that. Okay, hopefully you've had a chance to read those. I never know how long to leave. So the last thing I just want to talk about before I hand over to Chris is to talk a little bit about support, because I said right at the beginning that the main aim was to try and identify what support dads had received during their child's life, what they would like to receive, or what they think dads would like to receive. And you might not be surprised to see on the screen there that many had not received or accessed any forms of formal support, or support that had been tailored to them. Some had informal support, so they had some mates, they had some family members, but as I mentioned before, those social circles had become quite small over time, and some felt that they didn't have anybody to turn to. So the main message here, the main take home, is more support is needed at different key life stages. And in terms of what would be helpful, I think they can be grouped into 3 different areas, and not all dads need all of these things at the same time. So some dads talked about there really being a need for some targeted mental health screening early on, and also some regular check-ins for them. Some felt that actual trauma counselling with a specific focus on disability is something they would really value. In terms of education, they talked about knowledge and education being really key about their children's disability, but sometimes not being able to go to parenting courses or support groups because they're held in the day. They tend to be what they call female-dominated spaces, and therefore they don't get first-hand information. It comes secondary. And lastly, some talked about the real value of peer support. So if they've lost their friendship network, maybe talking to other dads that are going through a very similar experience will give them that support. It will give them a connection, belonging, and learning from perhaps dads that are a little bit further down the line. So there's definitely potential for all 3 of those things. And I know we have a lot of professionals attending here tonight, and maybe you fit into one of those blocks, really, in terms of your support and how you could incorporate more father focused support within your role. And the last thing that I've just popped up there, and this is linked to a much wider agenda, is just asking dads, are they okay? No matter what role you are in, no matter who you are, just recognising that they might be going through something, and it is tough. And lots of dads recognise that they just want to be asked how they are, and that hopefully will then open the door to them accessing support, or just in that time, in that moment, offloading some of their concerns and their worries. So I'm now going to stop talking for a bit. So thank you for listening to some of the exploratory results. I hope you find them interesting, and if you have any questions, I'll be taking those at the end. But I'm now going to hand over to Chris, who is going to talk about our resource.
Thank you, Emma. The project was funded in 2019 and 20 to focus on the well-being of fathers of disabled children. The Dads of Disabled Children Research Advisory Group was formed, and 5 of us fathers were recruited from Coventry and the surrounding areas. The key aims of the group were to build links between family researchers and fathers of disabled children, to share research related to families and fathers raising a child with a disability, and to work together to co-produce a resource aimed at supporting the well-being of dads.
Sorry, Chris, I am trying to change the screen.
It's okay.
It's not going. There we go.
Lovely, thank you. During the first national lockdown in 2020, we met several times on Zoom to design and then create a resource that was aimed at supporting other dads to be the best that they could be. We felt that it was important to share our own experiences and what works for us and our family, for looking after ourselves, and our family. We also wanted to create something that was dynamic and non-text based. So we opted to record conversations with Dr. Langley that were underpinned by family theory and research. And these were then videoed and then edited. And these were the resource episodes that we pulled together. The 5 topics were well-being, work-life balance, relationships, parenting, and acceptance and understanding.
Thank you, Chris. And just to say that Chris was involved in this project from the start as a co-facilitator, because that was identified as potentially a way of kind of addressing the elephant in the room, which is I'm not a dad. So I don't know if you have any reflections on this, Chris, just before we move to some of the themes in terms of, you know, how that worked, how you found it, and any advice.
Yes, of course. To be honest, when I first was approached, I thought it was a fantastic idea, because I'd got so many experiences I wanted to share with other dads. And the hope was that the other dads could relate to me because we'd have some similar experiences. And I believe that that was the case, so much that I think I've now transitioned from being a co-facilitator to a full member of the group. So I think it worked well.
Thanks, Chris. You did a great job. There we go. Okay, and handing over to Neil.
Hi, everyone. So just following on from what Chris has talked through, myself and Paul, no doubt with Chris interjecting, we're just going to really talk through a little bit about ourselves, you know, why we got involved, a bit about our background and our children, and then also talk about a couple of the themes that have been highlighted by Chris before, and just expand on those a little bit. So I'm Neil. I work in learning and development for a food manufacturing company, as you can see on the screen. I think someone asked in the chat about anyone had any experience of twins with disabilities. Well, yes, I do. I've got twin boys who are aged 11, just about to turn 12 in November, and they're both autistic. And they as anyone knows with autism, it's not just autism, there's other things that kind of come along with that, but rather than list all the acronyms, I'll just go with they're autistic with, you know, other difficulties. So a bit like Chris, really, I wanted to take part in the research because I felt like I'd got something to offer, and I'd been through, you know, a certain stage with my 2 boys, and so hopefully I could you know, add value to the group, but also that kind of need to connect with other dads, really, and kind of, you know, feel that bit of connection over, you know, shared common ground. So that was why I got involved. Next slide, please, Emma.
Sorry, it's just mega slow. It's having a bit of a... There we go.
So one of the topics mentioned was well-being, and I think well-being is something that, I mean, any parent, first of all, it can be challenging. You know, it completely turns your world upside down, and so and you stopped doing the things that you had probably previously done. So well-being is quite important. But then if you add into that the challenges around having a disabled child, all of a sudden, you know, it can become, you know, quite overwhelming quite quickly, and it does take its toll. I mean, we've got here about some of the things that came out of the interviews, is that, you know, it adds that level of challenge. It takes its toll physically and mentally. You know, it can be very, very draining when you're starting your day, almost, you know, battling to get your children kind of ready, do their self-care, get them into school, all that kind of stuff, as well as then go to work yourself. So it was recognizing about how, you know, physically demanding it can be, and then obviously the mental challenge as well. We've got a couple of comments from, this is from the resource that we created. So from Mark, he talks about that people that he's spoken to with disabled children struggle to get out, even to see members of their own family. And I can definitely relate to that. It's very easy to become isolated very quickly, because of the needs of your children, which you put first, and because it can be very, very difficult to bring children into, you know, what would be considered normal family environments. So things like birthday parties, things like, I don't know, going bowling, stuff like that, it can be really, really difficult, because of the extra needs that they have. We've got another comment there from Andy, who's just talking about the kind of the challenge physically and mentally. He basically says that he feels like he's on hyper alert all the time. It's just constant, and it's really tiring. And then a lot of dads express that having all of those needs, which are obviously, you know, genuine and real, but quite understandable, still makes them feel incredibly guilty as well. So if they decide to take time out for themselves, which we all need, you end up then feeling guilty. So you end up in this kind of cycle of, you kind of need a bit of a break, but actually when you do have a break, you feel incredibly guilty for putting your own needs first, or not being able to help as much with the day-to-day caregiving, as Emma mentioned. Some folks can't do that for whatever reason. Paul, Chris, anything to add to that? Go on, Chris.
Yeah, sorry, thank you. Yes, just on that last point, I know from my own experience, my wife's very supportive. She says, you know, like, go out with your dad, and almost pushing me out the door. So when I do go out, I spend most of my time worrying what's going on at home with the children. So I don't really enjoy myself, and it just seems catch-22. If I do go out, I'm worrying at home, and then I worry about not going out. You know,
or you get the text message,
yeah,
and you're thinking, uh-oh, something's going on, and
yeah.
you feel your time away is already kind of compromised, because your head's back home thinking, should I be out? What am I going to go back to? Do I need to go home? So yeah, totally get that.
Thanks, Neil.
So off the back of that, if we just move on to the next slide, Emma, please. So collectively, you know, we gave our own sort of advice through the videos, and these are sort of the top 3 kind of tips really, with regards to well-being. So number 1 is, remember that by looking after your own health and well-being, that will have a positive impact on your ability to parent and be a partner. So, you know, it's that whole classic thing of, you know, if you're on the airplane, apply your own oxygen mask first before you help your child. You're no good to them really if you don't look after yourself. So although it's perfectly natural to feel guilty at times, it's important to recognize that by doing that self-care, that you're actually going to have more of an impact, and it's going to be more positive as a parent and as a partner. Number 2 is about taking that regular time to do an activity that you enjoy. or if you're in a couple, you know, doing activities together away from your child if you can. Again, this just allows you that breathing space, you know, to decompress, to clear your head, etc., etc. And when I've done that, I do genuinely feel refreshed when I come back, even if it's just evening out with a friend. You do kind of feel like that change of environment, change of scenery, change of company does lead you to come back feeling refreshed. And then number 3 is to talk to other people, really talk to other people about how you're doing, you know, try and get that support and reach out for help. Guys, anything else to add to that? Cool. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Work-life balance. Yeah, so Emma's obviously already talked about that. It did strike me, Emma, actually, as you were doing your intro, that myself, Chris, and Paul have all probably changed our working lives off the back of this to one extent or another. And I'm sure obviously that those guys can add a little bit to that. But for me, work-life balance was like critical, really. I don't know how we would have survived without it. So luckily I was already working from home. I'm not one of these newbie home workers that's only started during the pandemic. I've been a home worker for 15 years. So I was already used to that, and that helped massively, you know, to be able to be around more. But it became even more crucial that, you know, having that real clear cutoff between work and home, and being able to literally just shut the computer or whatever and say, no, now my focus time is family. It can, as Emma mentioned before, there's a quote from the video from myself there, you know, you can feel really compromised at times, you know, because it's quite difficult to juggle both roles, and you sometimes feel that you're caught up in your work so that you're not focused on your kids, or vice versa, you're focused on your kids so you don't feel like you're necessarily performing your best at work. And I found that over time. Me personally, I walked away from a role that a job that I'd had for 25 years because they wanted me to not work from home anymore, and they wanted me to commute, which was going to be 3 hours a day round trips, and it just was never going to work for my circumstances. So I just had to make the difficult decision that it was no longer going to work for me, and prioritize what was important to me. I did that just before a global pandemic, so you know, time is everything with these things. As we've already talked about, there's a lot of appointments and things like that, so that can be quite difficult. It's not just about your work, but you might need to take more time off work to help support appointments, and that could be quite challenging. And then, you know, with employers, it's potentially that they might not necessarily understand your situation or be as supportive. There's a quote there from Paul saying that employers, they're okay, but they're not that understanding. And you know, I've spoke to a few fathers where that's been the case. I've been quite fortunate where I have been able to been allowed time, but I know there's a lot of dads that struggle with that. Anything to add, guys?
Well, for myself, obviously, you touched upon that work-life balance has changed. My work-life balance has changed as I'm a full-time carer, stay-at-home house husband now, which I was employed in retail for nearly 15 years, but decided to make that leap to support our family. So yeah, that was one of the biggest changes, to get the work-life balance right for myself and my wife, definitely.
Thanks, Paul. Emma, do you want to just move on to the tips for that bit? You're going to have to shut me up if I'm overrunning. Sorry, I have no idea what time it is.
Doing fine.
You're doing okay. Okay. So top tips then. So the first thing is to discuss it with your employers about your challenges right from the start. The best policy really is just to be open and honest and explain your circumstances. It's then far easier, you know, to then ask for time off or adjustments and things like that. Number 2, explore your rights. You know, understand what your company's policy is, understand what's legally allowed, so that if you do need to have that flexibility, you can do that. And this one is a quote from Mark, actually, from from one of the videos, which I really like, is to find out what works for you and your family. And that might not be what, you know, traditionally you would have expected how families to work, and you know, but it doesn't really matter. It's whatever works for you. And as you know, the guys have said, we've all made some significant changes in our work-life balance to make it work for us. I'm sure the guys will hopefully agree that that's been, you know, a really positive thing. And it's, you know, for me, it's definitely kind of been a bit of a game changer doing those sorts of things. Have I got the next one? No, I think Paul's got the next one, hasn't he? So over to Paul.
Thank you, Neil. So about me, as it says on the slide, I'm Paul and I'm a full-time carer. That has changed from the last time we've done anything like this, because I was in retail, as I said, for 15 years. And then after that, I've done trying to do a few different trades, but it's worked out that this works for me. It works for us as a family. My wife works full-time and I'm at home all the time now, but the kids love it. I do really enjoy it, and yeah, we have a positive experience. So I've got 2 boys and my youngest is autistic. There's, as Neil said, lots of different things to go after that, but we'll stick with autism right now. And I wanted to help with the research to show other fathers that you're not on your own, because when this first started, I didn't know any of the dads of disabled children, and it's really enlightening to have that experience and to talk through very similar experiences with other dads. So if we can move on to the next slide. So talking about relationships, in the video we talk about relationships within the family. So having a child or children with a disability can put additional pressures on relationships, especially between spouses and partners, other children and the wider family. Having positive relationships does have a positive impact on the whole family. So if you look at the relationship slide, you've got the 2 detailed key points there. So stress and time demands can have an impact on your relationship with your spouse or partner. A quote from Mark there, you do find yourself in a constant little cycle of battles. It's always just worth remembering that you need to take that step back and remember that it's your wife and it's not your battle partner. The second point is that it's less time to spend with other children and feeling guilty about this. Now, there's quotes from Chris and myself now. So our first child, he kind of gets left behind a bit. He just gets left out. As a parent, you feel you're neglecting him, and that's true. I mean, he can just get on with things, but it's like the work-life balance, and it's about taking time for yourself, that kind of thing. You constantly feel that you're neglecting or not doing enough, and well, that's the way I feel about it. And for Chris, that I've tried to make an effort to make sure that she feels as important, and obviously he's talking about his wife there. If we can move onto the suggestion slide. So these are some of the suggestions that we've come up with. Plan activities with your spouse, partner to do as a couple outside of the home. Ask someone you trust to help with childcare, even though this can be very difficult. Communicate regularly with your spouse or partner. Delegate roles according to each other's strengths, and dedicate specific periods of time to spend with your other children, or child or children, to do activities which they're really interested in. I've came up with a few other suggestions, and I don't know whether the other guys have got anything else. So you need to be cared for as well. You need to invest time in yourself. You've got to remember that you're not alone. You should always try and find your support group. Don't lose yourself. You should try and make time for yourself. So hobbies, interests, anything like that. As we've also said, dedicate time, make time for your partner, and time away. Even though it pulls on the heartstrings, there should be a time when you're not a parent. So I see a friend that I've had for a number of years, and we just meet up every other week and we go for a coffee in the evening when bedtime routine's done, everyone's settled, calm, relaxed. I head out for half an hour to an hour and I just have a coffee with him and I catch up. So I don't know if you guys have got any other suggestions.
I think I just echo that. I mean, certainly with the relationship thing, it's very easy for it to get very stressful very quickly, because of the things that you're dealing with and you're contending with, and as it's said on one of the slides, the battles that you find yourself in as a parent of a disabled child. So sometimes you do have to just take that step back and just kind of remember you're on the same team, and remember that, you know, like it is stressful, and to try and make time for yourself to sort of decompress, and time with your partner. So I just totally reinforcing really what you've already said.
Excellent. If we can pop onto the next slide, which I think is parenting. So parenting is already very difficult, but raising a child or children with additional needs can throw up a range of challenges and stresses. It's often hard to know how you will feel and what would have been useful to know when your child had been diagnosed. There's so many positives, even when things can seem challenging. So looking at the slide, we've got the 3 key points there. It's emotional. There's many highs and lows. It's a total roller coaster. You go through so many different emotions and so many experiences, positive and negative, lots of highs and lows, but there's no shying away from the fact that it is challenging, really challenging. And that's from Neil. Point number 2, there's lots of things to learn and less that you can control. So there's a lot to deal with. There's a lot to learn. It's not just go and take them down to the park and kick a ball around. There's a whole raft of other things that you need to get your head around and learn. That was from Andy. And the final point, but many positive experiences to share. So one of my favourite ones is from Chris, because Chris just talked about this. It's seeing his sense of humour develop. It's been a joy. So it is lovely to hear that. And also, my children always surprise me. They overcome challenges that at the time I don't think they will overcome. And that's from Neil. And I'll definitely echo that thought. For the next slide, which is suggestions. So you've got focus on the things that your child can do and they are passionate about. Every child can surprise and amaze. Number 2, learn and adapt your parenting and mindset. Look for small wins and go at your own pace. And don't compare yourself to others. Connect and talk with other parents who have children with a disability. This is really valuable. So similar to that, I just wanted to say, like, it's about finding your village, having your team, getting your corner together, celebrating the little things, which is on there, but those little things could be really massive for you and your child. Don't compare your children. No, it's really hard to do, but don't compare your children. And don't let parents of neurotypical children get you down, because sometimes they don't understand. And also try and remember to keep your sense of humour, because that's really important. I don't know whether Neil and Neil's got anything else that he'd like to add.
No, I agree. Yeah, you definitely need to keep your sense of humour. But I agree definitely with the, you know, adapting your mindset and looking for the achievements. I mean, my boys are 11 and they've not long just learnt to ride their bike, because they've got, you know, motor skill difficulties. So it's quite a big thing for them to learn to ride the bike, and now they're whizzing around like anything. And again, I think I said it in the quote, I didn't think that was going to be something they'd be able to do particularly easily. So they do, you know, they've surprised me. So it's looking for, you know, focusing on what they can do, and rather than what they can't, I guess is the key message.
Definitely. For the next one, we've got acceptance and understanding. We can go to the next slide. So for acceptance and understanding, it can be quite isolating, and you can lose touch with friends and social groups. There's often challenges with trying to get involved with your social network and spending time with others. Sometimes it's the stigma and the lack of understanding from others in society that prevents us from going out. We looked at the importance of acceptance and understanding for us dads and our families. So looking at the slide, you came up with 3 key points. The first one being that social circles can change, which requires adaptation. So quote from Mark, your friendship circles, they may unfortunately get smaller. I would definitely agree with that. A quote from myself, you'll make new friends with parents who understand and do not judge. So you'll get new friends, be that through Facebook or through children with disability groups or whatever it is. Everyone will make new friends, and those friends will probably be more understanding to your situation. And finally, we've got 2 quotes from Neil and Mark. Others might not understand. There are a lot of friends and family and other parents who just won't get it. You just have to kind of accept that. And finally, from Mark, so you can bump into people in the street and they just think that you've got a naughty kids. So he'll ignore people and crack on with what he's doing. If we can go on to the final slide. So acceptance and understanding, we've got some key points there. Accept you might lose some friends, but important people will stick around and want to be supportive. Number 2, as we've said already, find your village, connect with other parents of disabled children that know what you are going through and don't judge. Finally, don't let the negative reactions of strangers affect your well-being. Remember that there are lots of people who do understand and don't pass judgment. Some of the suggestions that I've kind of come up with would be to forgive yourself. You won't always get things right. Trust your instincts, find your people, which we've already touched on. In our family, we take no shame for declining invites to social events that we feel may be difficult for our son. But we're always more than happy to meet people in our safe place. So I don't know whether, guys, you've got anything else you'd like to add on that?
No, I agree. I think you learn to adapt your life to what's going to work best for your kids. So you know if that you're going to a noisy party with DJ or whatever is just not going to work because your kid's got sensory issues, then you don't go. Or if you can get a babysitter, you do that. Although obviously that can be quite difficult. And we've done the same. We've adapting holidays, adapting trips out, so it makes it as easy as possible, and that it works for you and your kids.
I would say as well, sorry for interrupting. I think your life can be as fulfilling with a disabled child, but I think you just have to judge your expectations. I know, as in life in normal, how you imagine things are going to turn out for your life is not necessarily the way it's going to be. But from my point of view, I wouldn't change a thing. If I had the opportunity to go back, I would like my life to go exactly how it has.
And that's a lovely thing to say. It's the same. It's like when people always say, I think people have asked, I know a number of people have asked me, they said, if you could take that away from him, would you take it away from him? I said, no, that's him. That's part of him. That would change him completely.
We literally had that same conversation, didn't we, Chris, a couple of weeks ago about the same thing. No, we're all in total agreement.
So, and then a last bit of the acceptance and understanding was talking about, I don't think there isn't really a slide for it. It's just I wanted to add it in there. From the research, Emma and a few of us dads, we've created a local face-to-face group called DADS. Now, the acronym is for Dads and Disabled Social. So we meet every other month on the first Friday of that month in Leamington Spa. It's a safe place for us to be ourselves. So you're welcome to share your experiences, and it doesn't have to be related to having a child with a disability. So you can just sit there and listen, or talking is not essential. And also it's our village, and it's a growing village, I'm pleased to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for adding that. Just for me to add, I think Jane's going to put a link to our little webpage that we've created, and I suppose it's just about us saying it's very much a social group, isn't it? It's not necessarily about support, but through the socialization and meeting each other, you do get support from one another. And although we've only had a few meetings so far, the group's starting to grow, and perhaps if you're a dad at home, it might be that you could look out and see if there is anything like that in your local area, or if you wanted to start something up, I'm sure these guys would talk to you about how we've done that. Very simple. Find a really chilled venue, bring along some snacks, have it a time that people can come. It's not being kind of that difficult in that respect. It's just focusing on exactly what dads need. So thank you for mentioning that, and hopefully you can see in the chat the link to the page that we've put together. So I think I have a slide or two just to finish off, if that's okay, and then we'll move to questions. Is that okay, Jane, if we're okay for... So just thinking about the variety of people in the audience tonight, and like I say, without knowing your exact circumstances and job role, it is really hard to advise. So if you do want to get in touch with me via email, I'm very open to kind of talking through and offering any suggestions and opening it out to the dads, because that's who I go to. It's not coming from me, it's coming from them and their experiences. But I just thought I'd talk through, or just get you thinking about some questions, and then give some suggestions and observations from what we've been doing so far. So like I say, this is very, very reflective, and perhaps you already have dads involved and you just wanted to know more about well-being, or perhaps you are in a circumstance where you would like dads to be more involved. So just some key questions really, which is, what is it that you want? Why do you want dads to be involved? And is this being clearly communicated? Because in the past, I think there's been I guess some confusion around maybe things that are aimed at parents or families not being specific enough to really appeal to dads. Are you having difficulties engaging fathers or retaining them, or both? Because that will involve different kinds of strategies. And have you actually been able to ask dads about why they don't engage and what particular support they need at that particular time? Because it's been invaluable, as you've just heard, for all the dads. Their experiences are key. As a professional, as a researcher, as a clinician, you might think that you're understanding something, or there's barriers that you see, but it might be completely different to what dads might tell you themselves. And just last of all, try not to assume that any contact that they don't have with you as a professional or with your service means that they're not involved in their child's care. It's more than likely they are there and they need support. It's just knowing now the best way to engage them in your work.
Can I make a comment on that, Emma?
Of course you can.
I think as you were just going through, I think I was reflecting back on when we started our research, and I think I was fair to say that most of the guys will agree there was definitely a lot of apprehension about that first meeting, and it probably took a few meetings for dads to sort of break the ice and start being a bit more productive and feel a bit more comfortable. I don't know if that's just a men thing in general, where we were a little bit standoffish to start off with, where females might be a bit more sociable. I don't know, but one of the ways to maybe break the ice is to do something virtual that's requires less commitment and gets people to dip their toe in the water first, really, and realize it's not such a scary place before they then maybe attend something in person. We were forced into that scenario because of COVID, where the intention was to meet in person, but it never happened until recently, of course. But that may have helped us in a way. So it's just thought I'd put that out there.
That's really helpful, and a lot of people I've already spoken to have asked me about, do you think dads want online or do they want face-to-face? Well, you've got to ask them, but I would agree that sort of that initial meeting, having meetings online, I mean, we were all kind of experiencing the pandemic as it was, so it was a shared experience anyway, which helped. But I would agree that it kind of broke down some of the barriers potentially, in terms of just feeling a bit worried about meeting other people. The other point I think that really helped, just moving on to the other slide, is the second point here, which is also having a real practical focus. I don't know if you guys agree, but because we had this kind of defined project of we're going to do something, we're going to create something, it was almost that became the focus, rather than come and talk about how you feel. But through the process of creating something, you did talk about your experiences, and you did open up. So maybe that is a suggestion for anybody that's trying to engage dads, which is, can you have something that's very practical that they can do, that they can create, that might get them involved in that way?
I think it was definitely a cathartic experience for the first few sessions, where it almost felt like all of the dads just needed to offload in a safe environment, and they've probably not had that opportunity. And then once we'd got past that stage, it was like, okay, now we can be more productive.
Yeah.
What have we just offloaded about? What do we want to talk about? So yeah, I think that definitely kind of helped us having that focus.
And just to wrap up, because I'm aware of time, and it'd be nice to kind of answer some of the questions, but you can just see some of the suggestions there, and about being really targeted. Make sure that anything that you're trying to do is very specific to dads. Have a practical focus if possible. Identify that some dads might need support on an individual basis before they engage in anything that's to do with families or parents and children. Engage them as soon as possible. Kind of makes sense, so you're not kind of trying to get them involved a bit later down the line, and that can even be just making sure you have dad's details from the start. Think about the timing. Where is the dad in terms of their life stage and their child stage? And I think the key point really, there's practicalities and things that you can see at the bottom, which I think are really minor, to be honest, but seek advice, getting dads involved at any stage, getting advice in terms of your messaging, your advertising, what offering you're offering out to people. Get them to co-lead things, look for good examples. I think that's probably the takeaway message really, which is collaboration is really, really key with this, both collaborating with fathers, but also other professionals and researchers as well.